Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the not really new anymore album from Luke Vibert, Grit. I feel like this has been a bit of a long time coming. Luke Vibert is a producer from Cornwall who's been at it since the early 90s. He's released on a whole bunch of the most famous electronic-focused labels ranging from Warp to Planet Mew to Ninja Tune to Reflex to Astralworks. He was a friend of Aphex Twin, once did a split EP with him, and RDJ named his Xanalog series of EPs after one of his tracks. He's done collabs with artists like BJ Cole and Jean-Jacques Perry. He works under lots of different aliases, most notably Wagon Christ and Plug, with his style ranging anywhere from retro acid and electro to breakbeat and drum and bass to trip hop and instrumental hip hop to deep house to ambient and pretty much anything in between. So long as it was prevalent in the 90s electronic scenes, he's probably done it. And given the typical subject matter of this channel, it should then come as no surprise that he's one of the most frequently requested artists for me to cover in some capacity. Truth be told, while I had been aware of Luke Vibert since probably before I even started this channel, I'd never actually sat down to hear anything of his for myself before starting work for this video. The guy has a particularly intimidating back catalog, again spread over lots of different aliases. I never knew where to start or how to handle reviewing something of his. The idea of doing an in brief segment on this guy sounded like a lot of disorganized work, but that changes with this video. When I found out that Vibert released a new album this past July, I decided on a whim that, to heck with it, it's finally time for me to just do a deep dive on his work. Even if it turns out that this new project isn't really anything to write home about, which, spoilers, it isn't really, it was a good excuse for me to catch myself up. Earlier this year, I reviewed a new album from Doppler Effect and used the opportunity of that video to go through all the various projects associated with Gerald Donald, and I decided I'm going to structure this in brief segment in a similar way. I'm going to first go through the catalogs of his three most popular aliases, Wagon Christ, Plug, and Kerrier District, and then I'll go through the albums he's released under his own name leading up to present day. And I'll only be discussing main solo studio albums he's released under those names. There's plenty more to cover beyond this, and it's far from comprehensive. There are other names he's released under, there's God knows how many EPs, but I needed to stop somewhere. The way I have set it up, this will be going through 24 albums, which is already going to be one of the longest in brief segments I've done in a while. So strap in, folks. Here's my thoughts on a decent chunk of his discography so far. Okay, so I'll start with going through releases under the Wagon Christ alias, since this was the first alias I heard about him through, and this particular album was his first full-length solo album overall. It's not at all indicative of what he'd become known for, a mostly straightforward ambient release with several long and slow-moving tracks, but it is generally nice for what it is and carries a lot of that early 90s aesthetic in its mix of wiry high-pitched synths and mildly creepy musical progressions. Probably nothing essential, but it is a neat curiosity that I all around enjoyed. But this is the one that everyone always marks as his big monumental classic and his best work under the alias, the project that really first put Vibert on the map. And yeah, this is kinda like DJ Shadow's Introducing a year before that came out. Straight instrumental hip-hop and trip-hop designed for the chill-out audience. It's obviously not as good as Introducing. It's a little overlong and took a while to really get going, didn't grab me in earnest until the track Rexist, but man, when it gets going, I got the hype behind this pretty immediately. Jazzy, funky, grooving, tuneful, light and playful, great stuff. Like the last album, but a fair bit better if you ask me. Much more consistently energetic and striking than Throbbing Pouch, which had a couple of drabber moments. Also much goofier, like if Funky Porcini lived up to the quirkiness of his presentation more. And with a few more acid flares, because, of course. I love it. This is probably my favorite album he's put out under the name. So of course, it was only natural for him to start releasing Wagon Christ albums on Ninja Tune, the #1 home for chilled jazz breaks with a slightly goofy edge, at least at the time. I don't think this is nearly as big a winner as the last two, but it hits a lot of similar notes and is also very solid in its own right. I was gonna call this one a more forgettable take on the same kinds of sounds as his last album, until the track Shadows came in and knocked my socks off, and the last two tracks were great too. Love how the closer sampled air. Still a bit hit and miss and had my attention trailing off in a bunch of parts, but it does undoubtedly have its moments. Might have to let this one grow on me, I don't know. Well, this one had more of the typical 90s synth textures and breakbeats than I was expecting, but it still definitely scratches all the same itches that the other Wagon Christ albums do, spacing out the old school ravier tones with the usual Ninja Tune instrumental hip-hop workouts does make for a pretty fun and well-varied listen. Out of the 3 albums he released on Ninja Tune under the name, I think I'd mark this as my favorite. And I guess with this one, the Wagon Christ progression is starting to come full circle a bit. A bunch of these tracks are not built around hip-hop sampling, but rather old-school 90s acid house grooves, with the old-school samples placed on top more as window dressing. It's not so much of a shift to not feel like a Wagon Christ album anymore, though, more just a further evolution in the direction he started moving in with Tomorrow. And I think it works just as well. In retrospect, it's a lot more like the stuff he's done under his real name, but we'll get to that in a bit. But before I get into that, oh, that is an unfortunate album cover. But yes, I need to briefly touch on 2 other side aliases Vibert used, starting out with his drum and bass-centric alias Plug, under which he's only released 2 full albums and a handful of EPs, but is so popular it's often brought up as being equal in importance to his material as Wagon Christ or under his own name. I've even had my own music specifically compared to Plug before. With all that in mind, I couldn't very well skip over this, especially this classic from 1996, which I often see highlighted as not only a pioneering genre definer that first set that whole drill and bass scene into motion, but also just one of the best drum and bass albums of all time. On that latter point, I don't think I would go that far myself. This meandered on too much for my liking, and nearly every track sidetracked away from its most compelling ideas into a lot more dull and empty territory. But I do still generally like this in spite of that. I can see the progression from, like, Wagon Christ's Throbbing Pouch into this, with a lot of dusty old jazz and movie soundtrack samples going over its much faster-paced mix of amen breaks and the like. And each track feels like it seamlessly links into the next. I don't think it's great, but it is pretty cool, and I can obviously respect it for its historical context, if absolutely nothing else. Ironically, though, the comeback album he randomly drops under the name in 2012 is actually a lot stronger than that supposed 1996 classic, at least for me. Album cover is still yikes, but the production is way cleaner and more striking and upfront. All these tracks are much tighter and have way more of a sense of purpose and direction, even when they run on longer. And his goofy sense of humor gets more of a chance to shine. This was actually great and much better lived up to the hype that people were setting for me. You could certainly make the case that Drum and Bass for Papa is better thanks to being much more forward-thinking and ahead of its time. This isn't exactly reinventing the wheel, but it's a much stronger listening experience in my eyes. The other alias that piqued my interest was Kerrier District, used for his excursions into deep house and disco, under which he released 2 albums and 2 EPs. This first album is pretty dang solid, stomping through lots of different cleanly produced plastic disco and house grooves and sticking in various different vocal samples along the way. If you're looking for something with a lot of visceral punch that really gets you energized, this probably isn't going to do that. It's a lot more light and breezy and chill. It fits more with like the phase action and metro area kind of crowd. More the kind of thing to lay back and tap your foot to than really get you on your feet, but it certainly is satisfying listen in that vein all the same. The second and third Kerrier District releases were EPs, which I haven't heard. I've heard generally good things about. But the fourth release here was a full album, so I heard that one. And it's pretty much the same kind of stuff as the first album. It is more repetitive and could wear out its welcome faster, but the grooves were maybe a bit punchier and had a bit more body to them on average. It's nice too. Probably not essential though. But that'll finally take us to the main story, the stuff Luke Vibert has done under his real name, starting with an instrumental hip-hop album in a similar vein to what he was doing under the Wagon Christ name, and even released on the same label DJ Shadow broke out on, Mo X. It does feel more overtly hip-hop oriented than even many of the Wagon Christ albums, aside from the handful of times he builds his mixes of samples on top of some standard amen breaks, and it can be a bit of a mixed bag, with some moments that really sink me into their vibe and others which just kind of fall in the background. But yeah, definitely some nice stuff here as well. But this would be the point at which Vibert's material under his own name diverged into more of its own thing, a primarily acid house project that also occasionally mixes those acid tones with a few hip-hop beats and packs in a decent amount of variety, Also his only album to be released on Warp Records. This one could admittedly also frequently fall in the background, but it is certainly well crafted for what it is, and proved he could bring more to the world of acid house than the standard cliches. And of course, I Love Acid is just as catchy as it's purported to be. But as far as mixes of acid house and hip-hop go, I was much more of a fan of this, his first full-length album on Planet Mu, which compiles together a bunch of material he'd already released on various EPs on the label. This project can often end up on the lighter down-tempo side, especially in its first half, but the grooves and various progressions of acid synths feel more striking and immediate and attention-grabbing than they did on Yosef. And man, when it goes hard, it goes hard. But this one was even better. Ostensibly a tribute to the origins of house and techno as indicated by the title, and it certainly does that job well, but more than anything it's like a culmination of nearly all the sounds and influences he'd explored over the years. While acid and techno are the primary focus, there's echoes of the styles from all his other aliases too. There's bits of drum and bass, and breakbeat, and trip-hop, and even some creepy ambience or some disco house-ish grooves like his Kerrier District material. This is probably my personal favorite album he's done under his real name. And now we're back to instrumental hip-hop, although this has a much cleaner, more plastic-sounding, lounge-centric approach to its sound. Seems to be widely regarded as one of his weakest and least essential efforts, and the R slur in one of the track titles was not confidence-inspiring. Though, I personally enjoyed it and thought it lived up to his usual standards. It's super cheesy and maybe a bit repetitive, but you could say that about a lot of his stuff. And if the general vibe I'm getting is kinda like bridging the gap between J Dilla and Magic Sound Fabric, I can't complain too much. Not a masterpiece, but it is solid. More of the usual mixes of hip-hop, acid, and retro dance, much more hip-hop focused than something like Chicago, Detroit, Red Roof. Could even pass as a later Wagon Christ album, but still balancing out a lot more stylistic variety than his albums under that name did. Very solid once again. Now this was his first album on the Hypercolor label, which he's most frequently stuck to releasing on ever since. And this one ditches all pretense of stylistic mishmashing or hip-hop sampling and just delivers extremely straightforward acid techno and old-school electro in its purest form. Nothing but the 303s, 808s, and 909s. It's also absolutely nothing that's gonna change your life, but it's unsurprisingly enjoyable as usual. This, as of now, is his last album to release on Planet Mu. Can pretty much copy-paste my thoughts on We Hear You onto this. Though this is more rave-y with a couple of tracks that seem more dubstep influenced, and boy, I did not see those Speedy J and Phil Collins samples coming. How surprised would you be if I told you that this whole album was another big 90s rave pastiche and quite possibly his most overtly, unignorably 90s-ish work yet? I suppose if there's any surprise is that there's no real, UK garage to be found here that much. It's much more house-centric with some breakbeat. But it's plenty of fun as per usual. Another collection of no-frills acid with zero twists or other genre crossovers. Somehow even more simplistic and straightforward than his Rhythmic album, and also much longer-winded. Honestly, pretty uninteresting and inessential, but I kinda just kept it on in the background and thought it was serviceable enough for what it is, I guess. The acid purists will love it in any case. But in 2020, he released an entire trilogy of albums under his own name, and all three of them sound pretty much exactly like what you'd expect from their titles. Amen Andrews is a frantic jungle breakbeat project, not unlike the material he's done under his Plug alias, but even more hyper-focused on Amen Break somehow. Modern Rave puts lots of 90s house stabs and samples over some slower but still fairly standard dance floor-ready breakbeats. And Rave Hop, of course, takes the tempo down further and samples 90s house to put over more standard hip-hop beats. I admittedly don't think any of them are absolutely essential, but they are all quite solid as usual and will probably live up to whatever expectations you had going into them for the first time. Which, at long last, brings us to here. Yeah, I already knew why Luke Vibert was so frequently requested, but he does more or less live up to all the hype that people have set for him. Not every project I've heard from him is a winner, and I can't say I was always comfortable with some of those edgelordish streaks to his sense of humor that shows up in some of his track titling, and those fucking Plug album covers, but thankfully that never actually played into the music itself. The guy is super versatile, able to nail tons of different styles with several great albums that sound almost nothing like each other, and he's committed to doing creative things with the standard 90s cliches that he can call his own. Now, that takes us to this latest album, Grit, the one I actually promised to review in the video title. I'll admit I wasn't going into this with soaring expectations. I primarily chose to review this album because it would give me the excuse to do that in brief segment. But it's gotten pretty much no buzz outside of his usual diehard fanbase. As often as I've gotten requests to talk about Vibert in some way over the years, usually they're asking me to review one of his old classics and not the stuff he's done recently. No one sent me a single request to cover Grit, and I obviously didn't even find out it existed until several months after it dropped. Again, this came out all the way back in July. I still figured I generally like what I'd hear on this thing since Vibert has a pretty rock-solid track record. I think the worst album I heard in this marathon was Valvable, and even that one was fine. Not to mention, like Square Pushers fans, I think Vibert's diehard fans are willing to point out when they think a project of his is lackluster, even when they won't always agree on it. I haven't heard anything bad about this one, I just haven't heard much of anything about it at all. And after hearing it for myself, as it turns out, well, this is another superscript-back acid house project with no samples or twists a la Rhythmic or Valvable. So, yeah, not the kind of material that exactly makes for a lengthy review, and honestly, I don't think this would have been proper video material at all if not for that marathon I just did. But, once again, it is nice for what it is. And I do think it is stronger than those two projects I just mentioned. Ironically, though, this isn't actually an album that I find notable for its, well, grit. This actually isn't even much of a gritty listen at all, unless you're talking about, like, acid in and of itself often being considered to be inherently gritty on a baseline level. The standard progressions of acid synths on nearly every track are the grittiest thing about this album, and it's actually extremely light and pleasant and inoffensive. If I didn't already have the context of Vibert's wider catalog, or wasn't actively trying to get the stick out of my butt regarding the datedness and overexposure of this particular sound palette, if you'd given this to me blind in like 2018, I probably would have written this off in record time, gone off on how boring and cliche it was, maybe even gone off on some tangent about how I was sick of the artificial intelligence sound, and maybe make some pot shots at B12 or something. I'm obviously not going to do that. This album may be fairly inessential to all but the diehard Vibert fans and the acid purists, but it is still generally likable in spite of how bare and minimalistic it can be. There may be tracks that deliver a really plain spin on the acid sound, like the opener Surrounded by Neighbors, or Weed Killa, or tracks with less pleasant and more dissonant tones like Decay Hole and More Noon. But there's a lot more cuts that focus themselves on bright but subdued melodic chords and get them to work off the acid progressions quite well, as seen on tracks like Patron or Afterning. They all create a very cheerful and laid-back kind of mood. And even if you do run into tracks that just kind of blend into that mood without doing anything to stick out, like the title track, there are plenty of tracks here that do have just enough of an identity to leave a positive impression on me. The shifting and mysterious pads and creeping bass lines of gas logs, the playful stabbing house synths on Swingeing cuts, the shifting evolutions of Xanalog, which seem to switch time signature a couple of times throughout the course of the track. Especially do like the bouncy opening stretch of that one. And of course the biggest standout has to be Disco Derriere, which finally brings in a bit more of his sampling chops by placing the typical acid progressions over this particularly gorgeous loop of dreamlike orchestral strings that get filtered in and out, with some of the usual shouting ad-libs stuck in there for good measure. It appears to be the clear fan favorite as well, and that is deserved. If you only listen to one track from this thing, make it that one. Oh yeah, and I also can't forget the closer, Screwfix Typeface. That one takes the exact same patterns and melodies as the opener, and amps them up a lot further to make them more striking and attention-grabbing. I thought that made for a pretty strong closer as well. But that's literally all I have to say about this project. I mean, this is overall a particularly difficult album to recommend to people offhand. These mixes are very barren, the textures are fairly standard and run-of-the-mill, and just stick to the tried-and-true Roland equipment. The album also runs on for over an hour and didn't absolutely need to, probably could have stood to cut out a few of those fillery cuts. I really can't imagine this album doing anything to, like, pull in new fans outside of Vibert's already established fan base, and I myself am probably not going to listen to it again after putting this video up. but it did just deliver enough for me to say I'm glad I sat with it anyway. Even if I do tend to like my Luke Vibert albums with more variety and life and energy than anything he had to offer here, if you're looking for better starting points for him, you can go to Throbbing Pouch or Tally Ho from Wagon Christ, or Lover's Acid and Chicago Detroit Red Ruth under his own name. And again, this album did not at all live up to its title in my eyes. I wouldn't be surprised if he just called it Grit as an ironic joke. But sometimes a light and pleasant experience with nothing but the purest bare essentials like this is all you need. You won't be missing anything transcendental if you skipped it, but if you're into this kind of thing and you do choose to pick it up, you'll get plenty of well-executed chill vibes and solid acid material that might brighten your afternoon that little bit more. And I enjoyed this just barely enough to let this get away with a solid 7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.